lucky to have these three here with us today. They've been absolutely instrumental in establishing Minnesota as a leader in the space of foreign animal disease preparedness. So thank you all very much for sharing your comments with us.
All right. Thank you, Jody, and thanks everyone for coming here this afternoon. I hate to say it, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's been 20 years since I've been to the Minnesota Pork Congress, and that's a shame. It is. But I'm very happy to be back. I'm always here in spirit, and I love working with the Minnesota Pork Producers Council, the Minnesota Pork Board, and the Board of Animal Health. We're doing this as a team presentation today, but I get the lead-off slides, so I'll do the introductions. Basically, we're here today because we want to talk about, is Minnesota prepared for foreign animal disease? And a foreign animal disease, the big one on everybody's mind right now, African swine fever. But there's other ones out there too, foot and mouth disease, classical swine fever, and things that may emerge, like is currently emerging in humans. Those type of foreign animal diseases. Are we prepared in Minnesota? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Just to remind everybody that there are some goals for foreign animal disease preparedness, and we've had foreign animal diseases on the United States soil very recently, most recently in 2015 with highly pathogenic avian influenza in Minnesota's turkeys. Minnesota was one of the hardest hit states. So we have a state, have a lot of experience with foreign animal diseases, and as the United States has foreign animal disease experience as well. And I like to think of myself as a lumper, not a splitter. And so if I just look at all the aspects of a foreign animal disease response, there's really three main areas of that response. The first one is to detect, control, and contain the disease, stop it from spreading. The second one is to eradicate, that's that Depop disposal side we'll talk about, and stabilize the region to get rid of the disease. And the third part, which I hope you're most interested in, is how to stay in business. How to facilitate those farms that are uninfected but trapped inside of a disease control area, how to keep them in business, how to keep their businesses going. And we do that through science and risk-based solutions, and that's where I like to hang out. So the three of us are going to attack this talk in that way. What are we going to do about detecting, controlling, containing? We're going to talk about Depop and disposal, and we're going to talk about how do we stay in business, how do we protect ourselves from these diseases. All right. So what we're going to talk about today is the plans we've made as the state of Minnesota. Where, of course, the foreign animal disease comes in. It's going to be a nationwide problem. The USDA will be involved. But we have to be prepared as a state, and we're going to tell you about those particular plans today. And thankfully, and maybe we'll always stay in this phase, maybe we'll always stay in this pre-event and this planning stage, and we'll never have to deal with the event itself. So while we're in this pre-event and planning stage, what are we focusing on? And there was a really nice webinar the other day put out by Wayne State University. You can get this one online about how to communicate during an agricultural emergency. And what do you do before the emergency strikes? Well, you develop key relationships, and that's what we've been working on really hard at the state of Minnesota with the establishment of the Emergency Disease Management Committee and getting all the people at the table. We're monitoring and identifying risks, trying to see how could this disease get into the United States, how could it get to Minnesota, what are the ways to protect us from that. And then we're going to try to help everybody understand that that is a risk or not. And then we're continuing to prepare and then develop these science-based response strategies. So this is the phase we're at now, and we're really working on these things every day. Oops. But when we're talking about emergency plans, you can't do this by yourself. And so there's that old image of the professor sitting up in the ivory tower, you know, planning their experiments. And I don't like to be there, but sometimes I get stuck there. So the academics are involved, and we have to develop all these plans as a partnership. So with our federal regulators and federal partners at the USDA, at the state, the Department of Agriculture, and the Minnesota Board of Animal Health, with the academics to provide the science, but most importantly with you, with the swine producers, with the pork producers, with the industry, forming that business plan together or that response plan together to prepare against foreign animal disease and develop these continuity of business plans for when a disease happens. So that's what we're going to talk about today. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Thompson, and she's going to talk to you specifically about what the Board of Animal Health would do when there's emergency disease in swine.
You guys need to hold your applause because Dr. Culhane will be back, and she'll even better the second time she gets up here. Did you guys notice what she said a few slides back, something about pre-planning, and that's where we want to stay? Wouldn't that be great if we could all just go home right now and not listen to this and not talk about this throughout the whole pork Congress and not continue to plan? I wish we were there, but we know, especially looking around at what happens within the world, what happens within the United States, North America, with the number of hogs that are on the road every single moment of every single day, that's probably not, it's not going to be beneficial for us to stay in that pre-planning phase and not move forward with even more planning. So as a state of Minnesota, representative of the state of Minnesota, regulatory agencies involved, that's the approach I'm taking with the next few slides that I'm going to be talking with you about. So what are our goals? Being prepared, having a fast diagnosis, fast response, let's get to that depopulation within 24 hours, and then containment of the disease. So being prepared is really a public-private partnership. It's about all of you, whether you're a veterinarian or a producer. It's about the state. It's about some of the contractors that the state has. But it's also about everything that you do every day to understand all of that in response to what could be a foreign animal disease incursion into the state of Minnesota. So vets and producers, rendering, feed delivery, propane delivery, understanding what happens every day on your farms and those farms that you're associated with is all part of the goals of the state of Minnesota. Being prepared, understanding and having that fast diagnosis, having that response, and containing the disease. So being prepared from a Board of Animal Health perspective, I'm from the government, so I have to use acronyms. I'm sorry. First of all, the ICS, Incident Command Structure. That is a tried and true organization for foreign animal disease response, forest fires, for floods, for many different emergencies. ICS is a structure that we can all depend upon because if you're trained in ICS, then you can be plugged into certain avenues, and I'll have a picture of an ICS chart coming up in the next slide. You can be plugged into certain avenues or certain roles no matter what you're responding to. The ICP is the Incident Command Post. For those of you that remember highly pathogenic avian influenza a few years ago, that Incident Command Post was initially in St. Paul, Minnesota, and we moved it out to Wilmer so that we were out amongst where the disease was happening. And then the other things that are listed on the slide up there, the supplies, the trained personnel, contractors, and of course our veterinary diagnostic lab, those are things that we work on every day. We have 2 months worth of supplies on hand. We've got the trained personnel both within the Board of Animal Health but also other state agencies, Department of Agriculture, Department of Natural Resources, the other state agencies that would come into play with the emergency response. And contractors. That was one thing we learned during avian influenza is very important, is to have contractors out there that can help us with the disease response. And I don't see Dr. Torsen in here, but certainly the diagnostic lab in Minnesota is top-notch. So this is the chart that I just wanted to, I'm just going to spend 30 seconds on this chart. I want you to get an idea of what an ICS structure looks like. Up at the top, we have the incident commander. That's the person that's directing what's going on within the incident response with the help of, and it's kind of a purple color up there, folks involved with safety, folks involved that have certain experience, certain knowledge, all informing that incident commander. And then down at the bottom, there are those avenues that I talked about, operations, planning, finance. Again, if I am trained in operations for a certain response, I can bring that training to an animal disease response, a forest fire, a flood, wherever I might be needed in that instant command structure. So Board of Animal Health, Department of Agriculture, other state agencies and private partners are all trained in that response. Oh, look at that.
That's the industry.
Let's back up and look at that again. So, sorry, apparently I need to get my glasses strengthened. So on the right-hand side where that arrow's pointing in, we've got a response committee, the Industry Emergency Response Committee. Again, one of those specialty areas. It's in that place in the incident command chart so that they can help out the incident commander and everybody else that's involved in the response with that specific information. So the initial response at the infected farm, what happens? And we've got depopulation and disposal rise to the top because, again, what do we need to do? We need to contain the disease. But having said that, there are other tasks that are going to be going on in the background. There are going to be record reviews. There's going to be tracing and tracking of live animals, fuel, feed, rendering, vets, workers, into and off that site, and I've got a very, very smart swine veterinarian sitting almost in the front row here. Dr. Yeski, what are you thinking? We need to know 2 weeks worth of records, 3 weeks worth, depending on the virus? Yeah, it's going to take a lot of work on that initial diagnosis to really understand what's moved onto that site, what's moved off that site. Was there an electrician there a couple of days ago working on some electrical? Did a UPS driver show up on the farm by mistake? All of that is very good information when we have that first initial response to the disease. Along with, we need to be concerned with depopulation and disposal that needs to happen as soon as possible to contain the disease. So moving then into the depopulation of the infected premises, couple of good written work up there, the on-farm euthanasia of swine that comes out from the pork checkoff group, and then the AVMA guideline for depopulation of animals. For all of you that have sites out there and for all of you veterinarians that work with those sites, having an emergency depopulation plan in place is important. I realize it's difficult, but those two are very good resources. If you're not familiar with either one of those, let me know or let somebody, Dave or Marie up here, know about it, and we can get you in contact or send you some of that information. But the AVMA guidelines for depopulation of animals throws out some very interesting options, such as, is it possible for the animals to move to slaughter? That could be part of a depopulation plan. Another option is ventilation shutdown. Now, having gone through avian influenza and the discussions that we had during that response and after that response, it's helpful to remember that ventilation shutdown usually or should have a plus to it. That meaning not only is it ventilation shutdown, but you also add either heat and or something like CO2. But all of that is laid out really well in that AVMA guideline document. And again, if you need any access to that or want any information on that, just let me know. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Dave.
There we go.
And then just lean closer to the
Will do. I'm going to do that. All right, so I get the privilege of talking about probably the more graphic side of this. And that's looking at a couple of projects. First of all, I want to just share some research projects that we're working on from an actual disposal standpoint. One is going on right now at South Dakota State University, started back in June of 2019. And first of all, I want to really credit Dr. Bob Thaler and John McMahon at South Dakota State University. They're the two actually doing the work. As far as who's paying for the work, it's your checkoff dollars. Okay, we took a combination of checkoff money from Minnesota, South Dakota, Iowa, and Nebraska, put it all in a kitty, and basically worked with the folks at South Dakota State University to make this project go. Okay, so that's, I'll jump into it just a little bit here. So this is just a basic diagram of something called above ground burial, okay? And this is from Dr. Gary Flory from Virginia. They happen in this one to use the example of a cow, but basically what it ends up being is you're going to dig a shallow trench, usually around 2 foot deep. You put the some sort of carbon material at the bottom of that trench. In the South Dakota State University trial or research project, they're using both corn stalks and also wood chips. And I'll show you pictures of that in a second. Then you put the carcass in, and then you would take that 2 foot of soil that you excavated out of there and put on top of it. So it's a shallow burial, okay? We're not talking digging down 6-8 feet. It's shallow burial, okay? This is a photo from Virginia. There are a couple of projects that are going on, one in Virginia, another one in Oklahoma, and then the one that we're working on up here to get in more of a colder climate, okay? So this is just kind of the basics of it. Again, shallow hole, lay the carcasses in, cover them up. But as we look at, make sure I didn't skip over one here. But as we look at what's going on at South Dakota State University, so this actually ends up being where the work is done. It's about 2 miles northwest of SDSU's campus. And they've actually went and dug then the shallow trenches and then put instruments in them. Now, when I say instruments, there's conduits that are put in there to actually measure temperature. So we'll see how breakdown is going within those carcasses. And then there's also separate ones where we've got basically lysimeters that are going into the soil at 6 inches, at I believe 18, and then 36, to see are we getting anything that's going through the soil profile, okay? So there are the actual trial itself. It's got 4 different pits. There's 44 carcasses in each, and this is the work that they ended up doing there. In the end, this is kind of what it looks like once it's buried. They did take and then just, again, put that dirt fill on top, put cattle panels around each pit, and then also set up game cameras to see if there are any predators that are coming and scavenging, okay? Now, this is a trial that's ongoing, but I am going to just give you, and this is straight from Dr. Thaler, on really their results to date. Because, again, I mentioned that there are pigs that went into some of the pits in June, and then there were pigs that went in November, okay, because we also want to look at cold weather side of this and see where that was going to bring us. So first of all, again, this is an ongoing trial. Talked about the June and November. Key takeaways. Carcass temps, okay, were probably a little disappointing as far as, you know, what temperatures that they got to. The highest that they ever got to was 77 degrees, okay, which as we look at trying to kill that virus, is probably not going to work, okay? The other thing, though, too, is, I mean, just like in much of Minnesota, there was record rainfall that occurred in Brookings, probably cut down some on probably how it could achieve temp. And then also, though, it's probably a worst-case scenario from a standpoint of what it may end up leaching through, you know, on the bottom. So as we look at that 6 and 18 inches and 36 inches, there was, let me take a step back. They did take and seed Seneca Valley virus as a surrogate into some of these carcasses to actually see what's going to happen as far as an inactivating virus. At the 6 and 18 inch depth, they did find Seneca Valley virus, okay? At the 36 inch depth, though, they did not, okay? So, again, if you're going to put that kind of rainfall through that soil profile, probably good news that you didn't find it at that level. At least that's what the input back from Dr. Thaler was. Then what is going to happen is here in the spring of 2020, they're going to be taking those seeded carcasses, the tissue from them, and do PCR. The ones that are PCR positive for Seneca, they're going to do pig bioassays. And so we'll see what actually occurs from that standpoint. So look for that data to come, and we'll see if this ends up being an option that's useful for us or not. The one thing that's attractive about this option is it may be one of the cheapest options, just from a dollars and cents standpoint, that's out there. But if we find out that it's not going to work from a standpoint of inactivating virus, obviously that's got its own limitations. The other thing in hindsight that we wish we maybe would have done here is done an option where we ground the carcasses and done a set of replications with that. Again, that's hindsight. It's something we may look at coming into the future. Okay. And actually, Dr. Thaler sent me this picture literally last week. He said there were actually when they were digging in there, which, I mean, I give kudos to the grad students that are doing that kind of work. But they actually had live earthworms that were all over the carcasses that were in there. So he thought it was just kind of interesting back even on November 19th. All right, then I'm going to switch gears just a little bit. And there were a small group of us that went out to North Carolina, Clinton, North Carolina, in August of this past year. And quite honestly, I don't recommend North Carolina in August as a destination to stand outside at a grinding carcasses field day, but that's what we did. And so basically what this is, and I'll just show you 3 different photos here, is grinding of carcasses along with a carbon source. In this case, it was wood chips at a 1-to-1 ratio by volume. Okay, I'll show you a little better picture in a second. But one of the things that I really wanted to point out here is, here's the pile that's coming out the back end of that grinder. Okay, it has kind of the consistency and the look of silage, and kind of stacks like silage. All right, so I'd say kind of the moisture level will be similar to that, probably a little bit on the drier end of what you'd have for silage. Okay, except obviously not green. Okay, there's going to be some red tinge into it. No odor, not big chunks or that sort of thing, but again, stacked and moved really pretty well. Okay, and this is run through a commercial grinder that's really used more in the tree industry, so a horizontal grinder. Okay, that kind of silver piece of equipment that's right at the end there is a piece of equipment they had from the Environmental Protection Agency, where the EPA was out there looking at monitoring for pig DNA to see, okay, are they finding it away from the actual grind site? So this is used kind of as a test. If you're not going to find pig DNA there, you're not going to find it anywhere. And then they had them about 250 feet in all directions of the site. Okay. This is just, so they had brought in a semi-load of deads. That semi-load of deads is laying on roughly about a foot of clean material, so clean wood chips, and then they've got a track hole that's there, or an excavator that's there, taking those, loading them into the grinder, and you can see in the upper right-hand corner that there's actually a front-end loader that's dumping in the carbon source, so the wood chips, on the other side. So you're feeding from both sides, carcasses in one side, your wood chips in coming from the other. Okay, going through the grinder and then coming out the left-hand side. As they feed that material and it drops onto that pile, they've already laid down about a foot of clean material, so clean wood chips, that pile is gonna land on. Okay, that should catch any sort of runoff. That's been their experience in North Carolina, that they really don't see anything that comes really through the bottom. Okay, if you have put in kind of that pad of clean material in the bottom, works pretty well. Okay. And then this ends up being kind of your the end product. And so stacked in windrows. Once the material is spread in a windrow, they take about 2 foot or so, 18 inches to 2 foot of, again, clean material, and cap it. And because if you have enough of a cover, they haven't seen issues from a standpoint of scavenging. If you skimp on that, you will have problems. Okay. And so they haven't been working with this for a long time, but there's a couple of companies in North Carolina that have been playing around with this for a couple of years now, and you just can't skimp on the cover. Because if you do, you're going to get odor that will come out, and then that's what's going to attract your scavengers. But if you put 18 inches, 2 feet's even better, of clean material, it works pretty well. It's what the information we got back. The other thing that's really attractive about this method is that when you grind, compared to using whole carcasses to do the composting, you may be able to get up to half of the actual carbon material that you would compare. Is it just dying? Or is it just me? All right. You may be able to cut the use of carbon material by up to half, okay, which that's a big deal because it's not only less carbon material, but your footprint would be about half the size, too, on the site. So that's a big deal also. With that, before I turn over the mic to Dr. Culhane, I think, for the next part, want to just give you some information on some other projects that we're working on. Is that the Minnesota Department of Agriculture did write a grant to USDA, Farm Bill money is what it comes through, to do some demonstration work in Minnesota. We worked with other states to get letters of support for this. Other state veterinarians, other state pork organizations did receive the grant, and now we're looking at the implementation side. May start part of it as soon as late February, which isn't that far away, and actually looking at grinding. So a grinding demo, similar to what we saw with North Carolina, except do it in cold weather. Okay, working with some partners that will be able to have some carcasses that we can put in there that have been seeded with, again, surrogate viruses, so we can do that follow-up work and see what happens from a standpoint of reaching temp and being able to actually kill virus. We have had a farm in Minnesota that has done a kind of a proof of concept of this back in November, and it seemed like it worked really, really well. Okay, so even in cold weather. But we're looking at, but in that case, we didn't have anything. We're really collecting cedar virus and that sort of thing. And so we're going to look more at that with this project and just a larger volume, plus try some corn stalks. I think ditch hay, I think, was another one, and then wood chips. Along with that, one other piece that's going to come with some of the demonstration work. So that'll be a demo that will come up again pretty soon. Another one will be looking at Depop methods. So it's one thing to talk to your veterinarian and work out a plan, but we need to probably have some options that your vet can really go to. And so that's something that will be more developed out, I think, in the spring and summer to look at some Depop options. Have some kind of ground rules we're trying to follow. Try to do it bloodless, out of sight, out of mind, and also something that's going to be easy on employees. So whether it's the employees that are carrying it out or if it's an outside contractor, I mean, this can be traumatic, and we want to try and figure out methods that can kind of meet some of those goals of Depop before actually then going into the disposal side of things. So those are to come. They'll be paid for with a combination of, again, checkoff money and also money from USDA in order to get that work done. With that, I'm going to be done so we can turn it over to you.
And we're not going to let Dr. Culhane get back up here as soon as that. I've got a few more slides to go through with going back to what we're going to be doing to stop disease from spreading and some additional government-related terms that you might be hearing about once, when and if we ever do get into a situation where there is an emergency disease response. So very generally, containment, the four major areas of containment that we can talk about are movement standstills, the biosecurity that you all would be doing on your farms, control areas that would be established once we would get a foreign animal disease here in the United States, and then also quarantines. And I'm going to go into each one of these in a little more detail coming up here. First of all, that movement standstill. This is an idea that has been pushed out amongst the regulatory folks. I believe it started on the federal level more so than the state level, but it would be something that states would participate in. So movement standstill, this guidance says 24 hours. What we're talking about now is probably 72 hours for a movement standstill. And here in the state of Minnesota, we're talking about live animal movements. So the thought behind a movement standstill would be it would, number one, give everybody time to think about, understand, research, trace, track everything that's going on with infected sites and anything that might be connected to those infected sites. And then for everyone else to really take a good look at what's going on with biosecurity and those types of things on individual sites. Now, having said that, the question that comes to me, and I agree, if our first, and we're talking about African swine fever, if the first case of African swine fever is in a feral hog in southeastern Texas, do we actually need a 72-hour standstill movement throughout the United States? And these are the discussions that we're having right now with USDA and other states. However, let's take a worst case scenario, at least in my mind. What if the first detection is in a sow farm that feeds nursery pigs into 3 other states? So very different situations, but that's the thought behind a national movement standstill, is it will help us ascertain what's going on the infected sites and also work with the rest of the folks that are watching that and making sure that it hasn't spread further than that infected site or connected sites to that infected site. So when a foreign animal disease is detected, what happens? And on this slide, there are a couple of those containment methods, the quarantines and the movement controls. So quarantines would be implemented for those sites that are considered infected, or they might be suspect, or they might be contact premises. And I'll get into the definitions of those in just a minute. Movement controls, though, would be in place for at-risk and monitored premises, all within a control zone. So I know you guys are wondering what, there we go, what that might look like on the ground. And again, this is something that we went through with avian influenza, and I don't know if any of you remember some of the maps that came out of that disease response. We had so many infected sites, over 100 infected sites in the state of Minnesota. Those control zones that go into place around each infected site, eventually it started looking like a big amoeba. But if you dissect it down to just one control zone, and what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to walk through, you've got a couple of definitions up on the screen right now, but I'm going to walk through, I've got a chart in front of me of what the definitions are of the different types of premises within a control zone. So first of all, you've got the infected premises, and that's a premises or a farm where a presumptive positive case or a confirmed positive case exists. And that's based on lab results, clinical signs, the African swine fever or the foreign animal disease case definition, and international standards. Please keep in mind, everything that we're doing here is not only just for the containment of disease, but when you move past that disease and get into recovery from having that disease, it's very important for international trading partners to see that we've been doing this. So the second, up in the right-hand side of that circle, you see a contact prem. Well, a contact prem is defined as premises with swine that may have been exposed to a foreign animal disease like African swine fever, either directly or indirectly, and including but not limited to exposure of animals, animal products, fomites, or people from the infected prem. So you've got one farm that has a finisher, another finisher down the road half a mile, and they have the same people that go in there every day and work with the animals. So that would be a contact prem. A suspect prem is a premises under investigation due to the presence of swine reported to have clinical signs. So that might be another farm somewhere in that circle, but those pigs are starting to show some signs of possibly African swine fever. And then the last two, very briefly, an at-risk premises or farm is a farm with pigs that's in that control area, but none of those pigs have clinical signs. However, because they are in a control area, they do have to prove to regulatory officials before they can move out of that control area. In the case of African swine fever, it might be by testing, it might be by some other criteria, and once they do that, they then become a monitored premises or a monitored farm. So again, a lot of regulatory language there, but I think it's important for everybody to understand this is what goes on in the background when we do have a foreign animal disease. And then lastly, and just to push this out to all of you, circles are easy to do, and they do work with a variety of foreign animal diseases. But I can tell you the turkey farms that were involved with avian influenza within the state of Minnesota in 2015 do not have the same types of movements, the same number of movements that swine production does. So when we start talking about network control, more than likely, in addition to those circles, and again, that's for disease control, it's also for trade purposes, we will probably have also network controls, which would take into account, and I'm throwing this out here right now, a flow of pigs. We're not talking about a whole system. We're not talking about anything more than the very minimum that we need to do to keep disease under control and contained. And in my mind, that would be the flow. And in the picture that we've got up there, we've got trucks moving onto a slaughter plant, some of them coming out of a control zone. So those would be the monitored prems. The pigs that are moving out of that control zone, there's something put into place so everybody is assured that they're not moving disease out of that control zone. They're crossing paths with the farms too. So we need to keep that in mind as we move forward. And with that, oh, God, Dr. Culhane does all these wonderful things, and I forget about them. And with that, I'll turn it back to Dr. Culhane.
Thanks. Now we're going to get to the part that hopefully everybody is really excited about. It's how to stay in business. And it's the part I like to do. I don't like to think about killing pigs. I don't like to think about burying them, but I know we have to do it. And as much as I am an English major and love definitions and words, I'd rather work on the facilitating continuity of business for all of you. And what this is, like I introduced, it's a way to move the non-infected animals and the non-contaminated materials out of a control area to further marketing. And that was the whole impetus of the secure food supply plan. So there's secure poultry supply, secure milk supply, secure pork supply, and secure beef supply plans out there, and secure egg supply plans out there. Pick a commodity, it's got a plan. And those are all developed to minimize these unintended consequences that controlling a disease automatically has go with it. And those have been in place from 2013. So why do we need to have these plans? It's because when we put these quarantine and movement controls onto the producers, everybody's going to be affected, even if they're not infected. So just some facts from the 2015 outbreak of high-path AI in our turkeys in Minnesota. There was 108 infected premises, and that's a lot of premises. It was over 9 million birds, right? But you have to remember there was 156 uninfected premises with greater than 21 million birds that never got infected, that continued to move and are still in business today. And how did that happen? Well, it happened because they were working together to make an efficient response. And all efficient responses requires that partnership that we've been talking about, because we need to share our knowledge. So Dr. Thompson and her team of regulatory agents from the USDA, they need to know how to drive the car. They need to know, this is the definition, this is an at-risk premises, what do I do in an at-risk premises? They have to control the disease. Whereas the industry, you all in this room, you know how that farm really works. You know how that engine in that car really works. You're like, here, take the car, it'll be fine. Take my farm, I know what I'm going to do with it. And we'll need all these things working together to have disease eradications that work, and they require input from industry to do that. And what happened, if you think about high-path AI, it just became so large so quickly. And it was just it was February 17th when it happened, and in March it started to explode, and pretty soon it became so apparent, so large, so quickly, that everybody realized it was all hands on deck. And the only reason that we still have a thriving turkey industry today is because there was an established relationship between the Board of Animal Health and the industry, and they got over that side of that outbreak, and they broke down all the barriers that were in place for that. So why did that collaboration between industry and the state regulators happen? It's because when Incident Command came out there, they needed help answering these things. How am I going to take care of 1,070-pound birds? How am I going to do that? And so the Board of Animal Health and Incident Command reached out to the industry, And luckily, because of other avian program diseases, they had this thing in place called the Emergency Disease Management Committee. And it was for other diseases such as salmonella or low-path avian influenza and things like that, that they worked together to have rules around that. And so we always said we wanted to have the same thing for swine. Well, I'll be honest with you, we wanted to have the same thing for all of livestock, but then we realized that having a dairy goat and a beef producer and a pig farmer in the same room, we really had different viewpoints on things. So we started, okay, let's pick one commodity we'll work with, swine in Minnesota. So our overall goal then to establish an EDMC for swine in Minnesota was to enhance awareness and address these gaps in our response, and then develop that preparedness response plan together. And the rationale behind that is, we'd been talking about it for probably years, and then African swine fever keeps coming up, and it was a real and potentially devastating threat, and I think it is still today. And we looked at our African swine fever plans. We'd been working feverishly, no pun intended, it happens. We'd been working very hard at the University of Minnesota on foot and mouth disease and not on African swine fever at all. And we realized our African swine fever plans were not really well developed. And we needed to get those plans happening. And so what we needed was a functional emergency disease management committee for swine in Minnesota to address high impact diseases like African swine fever or like a highly virulent PRRS or like another emerging disease. And so we have developed and to help develop those specific plans. And then the EDMC then would serve as an advisory board or advisory council to the Board of Animal Health. And all this has to happen prior to emergency so we can think of things that are practical, so that we can be proactive and that we can have things that are scientifically sound. Because if you listen to the news at all today, there's emergencies happening all over the world. And if you have no plan for them, things can get quickly out of control. And so who's on the EDMC? We tried to get all facets of the Minnesota pork industry, and thanks to that effort, we represent about 10% of the sows in the United States. We have both integrated and semi-integrated systems. We have independent farms of all sizes, and we have niche farms represented. We also have on the committee packers and processors, and of course, we don't all slaughter our pigs in Minnesota, so we have the regional packers and processors on board as appropriate. We have swine veterinarians involved, and they're private consultants or with companies or with clinics, and our state and federal regulatory agents, and not just the Board of Animal Health and the USDA or the Department of Ag that we're thinking about, but depending on the disease, we have the Department of Natural Resources representatives on board, Minnesota Pollution Control, other agencies on board as well. And within USDA, we have different avenues such as Food Safety Inspection Services, FSIS, who are at the plants, along with veterinary services. And then, of course, we have our industry representatives who work very closely with the Iowa Pork Producers Association and their group, and everybody from the Minnesota Pork Board. And then we have the scientists on board from all areas of the University of Minnesota, not just the College of Veterinary Medicine, where I'm from, but within the College of Vet Med, there's the Veterinary Diagnostic Lab, but also working with our folks in Extension very, very closely to get this information out to the hands of the producers, and then with CFANS, the various avenues there. And so what are we doing as part of the EDMC for swine? Well, we're really focusing on the key elements of the disease response. And there's many on here. And it all kind of, disease preparedness is a big lump for all of it, but communication is key. And so one of the things we're talking about is who should be alerted when there's an emergency and how should they be alerted. And if you haven't already done this, the National Pork Board has set up this text alert system, so just text pork crisis to 97296 and you'll get on that text alert system if you haven't done that. We're working on surveillance, what tests need to be done and when. We're looking on how to communicate. Hi, you're an infected premises. What are the rules around that? What does that mean? So clear language around that to get that information out and who should have that information. Biosecurity, quarantine, what does a good biosecurity plan look like? How to quarantine a hog farm, how to clean and disinfect a hog farm, how to take care of wildlife. We don't have feral pigs in Minnesota. We have feral pigs all around us. How do we continue to manage that? Things like that. We're almost done with this talk if you're looking at your clock. But this is the important parts here, is what are the things that you can do to prepare for a foreign animal disease, whether it's African swine fever, foot and mouth disease, or something we haven't even recognized yet. Well, the Secure Pork Supply Plan is out there, and there's some really nice biosecurity recommendations on there, specifically of how to develop an enhanced biosecurity plan that's very specific to your site. And they have a lot of nice checklists out there and a lot of nice tools to use and how to meet those. And what we're doing as part of the EDMC then, we're building on those Secure Pork Supply Plan guidelines to make them specific to African swine fever, to make them specific to Minnesota. So we've already talked about why it would be different in North Carolina, how we would depopulate and dispose of pigs there than we would do in Minnesota in February, for example. So how to make these things specific to Minnesota, specific to African swine fever. So building on those supply plan guidelines. Another very important thing you can do for a foreign animal disease, and this comes up through our EDMC calls already, is making sure that you have that federal PIN, that premise ID number. So yeah, you've got it, but now make sure that it's right. So I work with a colleague of mine, and we always use him as the example farm. He has pigs and goats and cattle and chickens and rabbits and sheep on his site, but he has one PIN. So that's probably not good. So we need to get the cattle should have their PIN because they actually are in a pasture that's separate from his hog barns and things like that. So verify that PIN. Make sure you have the right number of PINs to do that. Because we're going to associate those PINs with the animal movements. We're going to associate those PINs with the laboratory diagnostics. And it just makes everything so much better to have that accurate PIN to facilitate that rapid response. So if you do one thing today, just check to see that your PIN number is right, that it actually points to the gate of the farm, and that the information associated with that PIN is correct. And we can work through those corrections together because that's really important. Accurate information, and that's what the NOMS study is getting, accurate information. All that accurate information really helps facilitate the response. So in summary, I would just like to thank everybody for their attention. I'd like to thank the Minnesota Pork Board for their support of this initiative and the Board of Animal Health, who this is their emergency disease management committee, and they're going to use that to respond appropriately for you. And we've all established these relationships, and they're really key, and they need to be formed before disaster strikes. And I really want to focus on that public-private partnership. Nothing gets done without that. So having those, everybody work together and having all the stakeholders provide input is the only way we're going to have an efficient and effective response. And that's our goal here. So with all that, I'd like to thank everybody for their attention, and we have plenty of time for questions because this room is available till 3 o'clock. And so we'll take more than 6 minutes of questions. So thanks, everyone.
All right, you heard the lady. More than 6 minutes of questions, and I know that there was a tremendous amount of information in what they just spoke about, and feel like this can be very overwhelming. So is there a question of somebody that wants to get us started from the audience? Dave.
The control circle, is it going to vary in size depending on the outbreak, or is that control circle
So the question is whether or not the controls circle, if that is going to change in size. It depends, right? It depends on the species. It depends on the disease. Right now I know CIA, which is the Center for Epidemiology and Animal Health, is working on looking at African swine fever specifically. So it might be a different size circle than it was in avian influenza, but to your, very simply, yes, it depends on the disease and the species.
Yes.
So on that control area, I'm assuming we want to minimize traffic there. How's that going to be communicated, or what will be public with regard to the control area?
So the question is what's going to be public when we start establishing control areas. And one thing that came out of, you hear me talking about avian influenza, and I apologize, but it was a good experience in a way for the state of Minnesota and associated partners because we learned from it. One thing that we learned was having those maps for the public. One thing for the Board of Animal Health that's very important to remember is data that's held by the Board of Animal Health is private, non-public. In other words, I can't give out information on your site. So how then can we communicate something like where those control areas are at? Well, what we can do is put maps together that have different levels of access. What we did during avian influenza was announce via county. So the first farm in Candy-Ojai County was named Candy-Ojai 1, and then there was 2, and then keep numbering. So that's one way that we can do it. With some of the associated people that will be in those control areas, they're going to be able to see more versus what the public's going to be able to see.
How do you control the traffic though in that situation?
So the question is, how do we control the traffic? You know, at this point in time, there's really nothing put into place, whether or not you're thinking about state troopers or that sort of control. It would be the public going to those maps and understanding where the disease is and responding appropriately. So if you're a producer that generally travels through, I'll pick on Candy-Ojai County, you see the map out there that's one of the infected counties, it would be up to the producer, the trucking company, or something along those lines to reroute if that falls within your biosecurity plan. But Marie or Dave?
I want to just mention the outreach to truckers and so on.
What?
Outreach to truckers.
Oh, yeah. So part of the EDMC is we've talked about information management, and this would actually fall under quarantine, is how do we control that. So what we've done is to let people know who do we need at the table. And so we've reached out to our transportation group or transportation liaisons, and some of the transport is owned by companies, so the larger integrated system also have their own transportation unit. And then a lot of people contract with the same amount of transportation. And how do we communicate to those truckers to say we're going to have specific routes? When you do for high path AI, and this was not just Minnesota, but in Indiana as well, when we wanted to move birds out of infected areas, part of the criteria for moving those birds out of their farms into the slaughter plant was that they followed specific routes. So they didn't drive by your farm and your farm and your farm and your farm. They went a different way to the slaughter plant, for example. And that's something that the case manager and the farmer would work on together. But as far as like state troopers on the road saying, nope, turn your truck around, that's not something that Minnesota does. So,
From a financial standpoint, if worst case is probably having to depop a large sow farm, what would be financial resources, if any, available to the producer that would have to put down 3,000 sows?
Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong. So our understanding is you look at the federal government. So if a site is positive, okay, federal government does have dollars for reimbursement, okay, of cost to do Depop. The producer could do it themselves and actually apply basically for reimbursement. And then the state of Minnesota, and Dr. Thompson mentioned earlier, does have contractors that would be able to do that also. But that would be something that would be a discussion between the case manager and the farmer to see how that would actually work. Because again, I mean, you may have staff on your farm that just doesn't want to do that, right? And so it can work kind of either way. So there is a separate pot of money, so to speak, for Depop and disposal, okay, that can be reimbursed. And then there also is the indemnity for the animals. I do want to make sure that to not promise, okay, federal money that may or may not be there. Okay, today our understanding is it would be, but depending on the size of an outbreak, those pots of money can run out, and then you've got to talk with the federal government again. But that's in a nutshell how it would work if you were case number one. Okay.
And I handed the microphone to Dave because he does a much better job of explaining that than I generally do. So if you're looking to state or federal government, there are, on the federal level, again, there's that indemnity. Before the pigs would be depopulated, somebody would come out and fill out the paperwork and get that indemnity paperwork up to the federal government. During avian influenza, our legislators came together very quickly and put together a pot of money that we were able to use there. So a couple of different avenues in addition to whatever the producers and veterinarians can put together too.
So is there a guideline put together today if a site is suspected that the procedures they have to go through so they do not start Depop, they have to get a confirmed diagnosis, inventory of the site to move to a Depop? I mean, I'm sure there's going to be some type of plan, and is that available today?
Yeah, and so to that question, generally speaking, for federal indemnity to be available, we do have to wait until the disease is confirmed at a federal laboratory. So that is part of the procedure. Having those folks, the federal folks in the state, which we do, who are able to go out and run through the indemnity and get that paperwork started, that is also in place. Now, when it comes to depopulation, that is where we look to producers and veterinarians for help with that, because those are your sites, and if there is some help that you can have or give to both the federal and state governments on those.
In regards to the land that either, I'll call it a compost or the trench type is being done, what becomes of that land? Is it monitored for a period of time? When is it turned over? And then have DNR or MP, Soil Pollution Control weighed in on that? Permitting, is that all out the window? It just happens this way?
Either way. It's yours. Thanks. Understanding, again, is that as we look, the rules aren't necessarily all the same when you're dealing with something that's like a catastrophic disease, right? But one of the things that we're very confident in, I mean, you're never 100%, but you notice that we didn't talk about deep burial, right? Well, you look at where the majority of pigs are raised in Minnesota is on ground that's tiled. Okay, we've got fairly high water table. And the experience has been when you do bury pigs, any livestock, in like a deeper pit, it may be the gift that keeps on giving from an environmental standpoint. And so, you know, as that's part of what's, again, drawn us to a couple of these options as far as the shallow burial and also the composting, because it probably contains the absolute least amount of risk for groundwater contamination, and then the other pieces that, you know, you're doing it on site and not moving diseased animals around. But is it perfect? No, we're pretty darn confident from a groundwater standpoint. Though those are really low risk options, and we'd be able to do them. One other thing that farms should think about though, and should do some math just on their own. And there's calculators out there for these methods to see how much room you need to, that you're going to need in order to do these. The room would be less, okay, so the amount of space would be less on the grind and compost than it would be on the shallow burial by quite a bit, okay? So let's say you've got a 5-acre site and you don't have enough land on that site that you own in order to look at these options. You know, having a discussion with your neighbor and getting something put into place agreement-wise would be really smart to do. But I think from an environmental standpoint, and it's also part of why we're doing this research, right? We need to make sure we've got data that we can show environmental agencies to say, you know what, this is going to be safe. And that's part of why we're doing the research too. But I think we're going to be in pretty good shape.
Thanks, everybody. Really good presentation. Dave, you kind of hit on part of what my question is right there, but be curious, from a producer perspective, we've done our SPS, we've double-checked our premise IDs, and everything checks out there. What else at this point should we be doing to prepare or to be ready, just from a producer perspective?
It's a great question. So if you've done your secure pork supply, you've done your pins, The risk management. Go ahead.
It's, one of the things would be how are you going to communicate to the people that service your farm or the people that come to your farm to let them know that they shouldn't come, or to find ways to that they can enter your farm safely. So whether you're going to set up your own cleaning and disinfecting stations on your farm, whether you're going to put a new driveway in for the renderer. That's what some of the turkey producers did, is they built composting sheds, and then they secured refrigerated trucks for rendering so they could decrease the times that the renderer had to come to their farm. They relocated the rendering bin. So communicating with those people that come onto your farm, and garbage would be the other thing, garbage renderers, and how your people come onto your farm. Work on those ways. The other thing is if there's a movement standstill. The slide that I presented was 24, and that was from July 2019. Now they're talking about 72 hours. How could you run your farm for 72 hours if nothing new could come onto your farm for those 72 hours? And let's say somebody gets really extreme and says no feed can come for 72 hours. What could you do? So having those types of things. And I think in Minnesota, I think we are in a good situation is that we've had to practice these things. They're called blizzards. There's some snows come. And so when you can't get to the farm, how does that happen? And in North Carolina, they did things like, they set up cots and stuff, and they slept at the farms until the hurricanes went through and things like that. So those are the types of things that you can do now. There is another, we talked about some farm bill funding, some other farm bill funding that went out and that was awarded and is a multi-state kind of partnership thing, is this thing called the Authorized Swine Testing Agent. And so we don't have to have, hey, veterinarian, when can you get to my farm and test my pigs? You could actually be certified to test your pigs and collect the samples and submit them to the lab. Because there certainly aren't enough people to go around to do all the testing that would be needed to meet the needs of our trading partners. So watch for those authorized swine testing agent things. Those would be some things that I would do immediately. And what we like to call these, and I have a whole nother lecture we could do, we call that the hunker down. How could you do the hunker down? How could you separate your farm from all the sources of infection that are out there? So it's my job at the university to find those sources of infection and let you know what they are. And then we work together to figure out how to separate myself from those sources of infection so I stay uninfected.
Yeah, one thing now. One thing I'll add is that, so composting was brought up. And we had a meeting with the state NRCS office here recently. Actually, Troy Daniels, the state conservation, is sitting right over here. Quite honestly, one of the best meetings that I've had with a federal government office in a long time. Was actually there to help, and it was great. So I would urge that if you've looked at, I said federal government, Beth. So if you've considered composting before, and you looked at it and thought, oh boy, a composting shed was going to be too expensive. I had all sorts of rules and regs and red tape to jump through, and you just kind of walked away from it. I'd encourage you to go back and revisit your local NRCS office, because there's some waivers of some prior requirements that are going to be in place that will save some money, and they're also open to some alternative designs. Can't guarantee, but they don't have to be the designs that we've always had. So it may reduce the cost of those. Plus, we're hopeful then that some cost share money can come along with that too. And so again, Troy, maybe if you just want to just even stand up or even address that, but I tell you what, it was really refreshing to look at kind of the new attitude from a standpoint of cost sharing on some of those conservation things. And so that's one other thing if you're not doing composting but you're considering it, or you were discouraged by it before, I'd encourage a second look.
Yeah, David, does this work? So we will have an environmental quality incentive program roll out here pretty soon. We have it each year. I've actually ramped up the funding for primarily livestock operations this year, and we're going to ramp up our ranking criteria, not the criteria to put in a composter, but we're going to make them more competitive. In recent years, they haven't been that competitive to get funding. But I think there's a real need to be proactive and not reactive in Minnesota, and this gives an opportunity to be proactive. And of course, David and I visited. We also have a practice that we can use in an emergency situation, which is emergency disposal of livestock. And it's a pretty broad spectrum of things that it can pay on, but we didn't have that in place in Minnesota. We have it in place now. We have permission to use it. So if something arose, then I would have a way to say, hey, we've got a component in place that we can fund. Just send us the money and we'll work with the state agencies and make it happen. So thanks for letting me be here, David. Oh, yeah.
Make it peaceful. Steps. Take that, Mike.
Is the question directed back here or up front? Okay, thanks.
So the question that I had was, as we went through the exercises and working through the trial exercises, one of the what I would say weaknesses we discovered that we probably all knew but nobody really wanted to talk about was using rendering. And not that rendering isn't a great service, but as we look at it, it becomes more difficult. Is that something everyone needs to go back and take a look at, or maybe you could share some of the experiences from the exercise?
So Dr. Yeske brings up a very good point. I don't know, and I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I think rendering is still a very important tool for some of you for DEDS. And I think that's something that, as a regulatory agency, we need to take into account. So after that, the exercise that happened a few months back, certainly we talked to, and we are now including rendering companies in some of the planning that we're doing, as Dr. Culhane mentioned, with the EDMC, and I'm not sure if that was up on the screen or not. But it's important because it is a component of what business is for pork producers within the state of Minnesota. What that looks like, we in our regionalization group, I think it was just last week, we had a couple of the rendering companies participate in that call, and they will continue to participate in that call, and we're going down the road of including them in on biosecurity planning, what it looks like for their companies and what it would look like in the middle of an outbreak. In addition to that, looking at tracking for them. If they pick up at one farm, where do they go from that farm? And then after that, because rendering companies, it's not just their employees, they also have contract workers too. So getting a good handle on what it is we have for rendering in the state of Minnesota has been after the exercises, one of the points that we needed to work on.
Well, I guess I can. So rendering is also very important for the turkey industry as well. And we did, speaking of sharing successes, we did successfully secure a grant to study avian influenza risk pathways through rendering, mortality management, and how that affects avian influenza risk and spread. And I think a lot of the pathway analysis stuff we're going to learn on avian influenza would apply to swine diseases as well. And the biggest thing is identifying those rendering partners. And we've done that now. And as we continue to talk with them, they continue to be more open with us and invite us to do things in the new senior swine veterinarian for the state of Minnesota, Dr. Brian Hefts, has been invited to speak to the renderers at their conference in June. So just opening up that pathway is going to be super important. So opening up that communication line will be important.
Any other questions?
I've got one here. I was just curious, I was involved in a fire situation. Which organization or agency has the ultimate say in a situation of an outbreak? What we were involved with was very frustrating with that police. So they all wanted to be in control, and we got a lot of conflicting information, and who was the ultimate that has that say?
And without knowing your specific situation, if it's a foreign animal disease, that chart that I had up on the screen, ultimately it falls to a case manager that would be assigned to your site, and that case manager reports back up ultimately to incident command. So what agency would come involved? It would either be on the state side, the Board of Animal Health, or on the federal side, it would be USDA Veterinary Services. Those are the two agencies that are in control, I'll say, when it's a foreign animal disease response. You call me, okay?
if there aren't any other questions, one thing I wanted to really make sure that everyone knows is that we were really, and I think all of you know this, we've got a high-quality university here and a high-quality Board of Animal Health. And so as we look at paying for Marie's time and her talents, that has been split 50-50 between the Minnesota Pork Board and the Board of Animal Health. Because we're in this together. And so just the attitude of folks that have been involved, and there's a number of you in this room that are also among the 66 that have been involved up to this point, some a lot, some not as much, but everyone to a degree, has made this so much better than if it was just done in a vacuum. And so it is, I think, a real true partnership. But we don't have any illusions. If something happens, they're still the regulatory agency. And they're going to have to do what they need to do to carry out their mission. But to do this work ahead of time, I think puts us in a much, much better position to address something that is not going to be any fun if it ever happens. So with that, I want to make sure that people understand, how much we appreciate the work that they're doing and getting this rolling.
So, Dave, I've got a question, or for the panel, I guess. So there is a lot of information here, and as we know, we all kind of say we reserve the right to get smarter as we learn more, right? So as information evolves, research is developed, what are some resources or locations where producers can go to access the most recent and relevant information on secure pork supply or other research or foreign animal disease preparedness?
So the University of Minnesota Swine Extension page has excellent resources on biosecurity and how it walks you through the secure pork supply plan. So U of M Extension Swine, it'll get you that and all those articles. The secure pork supply plan, just Google secure pork and you'll get to those secure pork supply resources. The University of Minnesota, if you're specific on specific disease concerns like ASF, has an ASF Watch channel that you can continue to get the updated information and this background information on ASF as well. And so those would be some sites I recommend. The Minnesota Board of Animal Health has an Animal Bites newsletter that goes out and a lot of communications. We're having a communications meeting tomorrow morning right at this meeting to further that communication. But those are some great places there. In Minnesota Pork, and then the pork producers have the FAD Watch or FAD Alert page as well, so which has great information to link out there. So.
Thank you. And then one final question. All of us in the room, and I can see the concerns on your face, we're thinking about our herds, we're thinking about our soils, we're thinking about all this stuff. But as it relates to the impact that this will have to people and farmers and mental health, Dave, I'm wondering if you could comment on resources that would be available for our people in the industry.
So there would be a couple. One is that, all counties in the state, through their county government, have got mental health services that can be available through this. The other thing is that the state of Minnesota, through the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, has a couple of people that specialize in rural mental health. It was just one person, but now they just added a person, and I didn't even realize that she did this work, but the one they just added is someone that grew up across the half section from where I grew up. And so I think the other big thing, too, is just there's resources out there. And I think sometimes we see people in our communities that, you see things maybe aren't quite right. Sometimes it takes a friend to kind of, talk to that other friend and say, hey, there's resources out there. Because I think they can be marshaled up to do that. So I think part of it just goes back on us in communities, too. But there are resources that county governments have for mental health, and then also the state does, too.
Great. Well, thank you all very much for all of your comments, and again, appreciate the collaboration that we have with the Board of Animal Health, the University of Minnesota, and the Pork Board. I would assume you all will be around out in the hallway or up in here for any further questions. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and please join me in thanking your panelists today.